Hi, everybody. My name is Adwaita Mohanty, and I am a sophomore, and I'm presenting from California, and I'll be talking about the impact of schizophrenia on brain structure and function. I mainly chose to research schizophrenia because I'm really interested in neuroscience. It's what I plan to study going into college, and also researching mental illnesses in general. There's a lot of stigma around it, and the first step to breaking the stigma is to research it. And before I start, I'd like to thank my mentor, Angela Spears, for being a huge help with this research paper. She guided me through the entire thing. So, schizophrenia. You've heard the word, but do you know what it actually means? It's really not just when you think of schizophrenia, you think of like hearing voices or acting weird or paranoid, but it's actually a fundamental disruption in how the brain processes reality. And your thoughts fragment, your senses distort, and your own perception turns unreliable. And really, schizophrenia presents itself with three main categories of symptoms. Positive symptoms, which include hallucinations and delusions, basically distortions of reality. Negative symptoms are a lack of motivation, diminished emotional expression, and a withdrawal from social interactions. And cognitive symptoms, they affect memory, decision making, and processing speed, which makes daily life just way more challenging. And these symptoms are not random, they result from distinct structural and functional changes in the brain. So, for what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the structures of the brain that are affected by schizophrenia so that when we go to the results section, it's more meaningful. So, one of the structures affected by the brain is the temporal gyrus, and it's responsible for auditory processing and language comprehension and helps us to understand sounds, interpret speech, and process emotions tied to tone. So, damage or dysfunction in this region can lead to difficulties in understanding speech. Um, and recognizing emotions and voices. And it also the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is also affected by schizophrenia, and it's essential for learning and memory, and it stores new information and retrieves past experiences. So without a properly functioning hippocampus, forming new memories becomes incredibly difficult, and this structure also plays a role in spatial navigation. So your hippocampus helps you understand and remember physical environments. Lastly, or not lastly, but another structure is the amygdala, and it's the brain's essentially emotional processing center, and it helps us to recognize emotions in others, regulate our own emotions, and process fear and reward responses. So, an overactive amygdala would lead to heightened anxiety, while an underactive amygdala can dull emotional responses. Next, we have the basal ganglia. And the caudate nucleus and the pallidum are both part of the basal ganglia. And so I'm just going to be referring to the basal ganglia as a whole. So it's involved in movement, motivation, and habit formation, but it's mostly known for like controlling your movement. And they help regulate voluntary movements and play a role in motor learning. And so dysfunction in this area can lead to movement disorders such as tremors or rigidity and the thalamus. So the thalamus is basically the brain's relay center, and it directs sensory and motor signals to the appropriate area. It plays a role in alertness and consciousness. So if the thalamus is damaged, then sensory information may not be processed correctly, leading to confusion and disorganized thought patterns. Okay, so next we have the ventricles. So ventricles are essentially like spaces in your brain, and they're fluid-filled cavities that cushion the brain and regulate its chemical environment, and they play a crucial role in removing waste and maintaining brain pressure. All right, so next we have gray matter. So gray matter is a brain tissue that processes information and controls movement, memory, emotions. It's essentially like crucial for communication. And it's found in the surface of your brain and also in the deep areas of the brain, including the cerebrum, and the brainstem, and the inside of your spinal cord. And it creates kind of like a horn-like structure inside of your spinal cord. And it consists of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, short myelinated and unmyelinated axons, glial cells, capillaries, just a lot of things. And white matter is also similar. It's a tissue in the brain and also in the spinal cord, and it consists of myelinated nerve fibers called axons. So myelin is a fatty insulating sheath that covers the axons and gives white matter its characteristic white color. And white matter is crucial in communication within the nervous system, and it facilitates the rapid transmission of electrical signals between different parts of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so just for formalities, so how I conducted this, so I wrote a systematic review, and so for our study, we applied specific exclusion criteria to ensure we focused on schizophrenia's direct impact on brain structure and function, and so we excluded studies that were not schizophrenia specific or primarily examined genetics or antipsychotics effects on the brain rather than schizophrenia itself, and we conducted our research using PubMed and Google Scholar, and so here are the mesh terms, and the search in PubMed yielded 30 studies, and 9 of which met our inclusion criteria for further analysis, so I used those in my review. So now this is the good part, the results. So the hippocampus, like I said, is the brain's memory hub. It stores new information, retrieves past experiences, and spatial, and also is develops your spatial awareness. And so in schizophrenia, it's found to consistently shrink, especially in the left hemisphere. And so this atrophy disrupts memory and sort of blurs the line between reality and imagination and scrambles your spatial awareness. So research links hippocampal dysfunction to hallucinations and delusions because the brain falters in processing and storing the information accurately. Next is the amygdala, which again is the brain's emotional center, and it regulates fear, processes threats, deciphers facial expressions. So in schizophrenia, it often misfires, and this fuels the paranoia and emotional instability that we see. And some studies suggest that it overreacts in neutral or ambiguous social cues, and which is why individuals with schizophrenia frequently misread others' intentions or experience heightened paranoia. The temporal gyrus, which is the brain's auditory and social decoder, and it's crucial for processing speech, recognizing voices, and interpreting tone. And so, in schizophrenia, structural abnormalities may contribute to auditory hallucinations, which is kind of like the hallmark of schizophrenia. Um, and this is because internal thoughts are mistaken as external voices. So the brain struggles to filter self-generated speech from real sounds, a glitch tied to the reduced gray matter and the superior temporal gyrus, which I'll be going over later when I'm going over the reductions in gray matter. And so this not only affects hearing, but also skews cognitive processing and makes, again, everyday interactions are just difficult for people with schizophrenia. Next, we have the basal ganglia, which is movement and motivation, and they show structural abnormalities. So the disruptions in the basal ganglia, the caudate nucleus, and the pallidum help explain movement-related symptoms like slowed reaction times and motor rigidity. The thalamus, which is the brain's central relay hub for sensory and motor signals, is consistently smaller. In individuals with schizophrenia, there's a reduction in volume. And so this shrinkage is tied to disorganized thinking, sensory misperceptions, and cognitive deficits. And since the thalamus filters sensory input, its dysfunction fueled hallucinations and again blurs that line between internal thoughts and external reality. And so research suggests that impaired thalamocortical connectivity, which is really just how the thalamus communicates with other brain regions, underlies the fragmented thinking and attention deficits, which is characteristic of schizophrenia. So next we have the white matter deficit. So again, white matter is the brain's communication network and it connects different regions to allow for smooth information processing. So in schizophrenia, white matter pathways are disrupted and they lead to slower cognitive processing, impaired coordination, difficulties integrating thoughts and actions. So studies using the diffusion tensor imaging, or just DTI, have found lower fractional anisotropy, or just FA values. And really what this means is just it indicates weaker neural connectivity. So this explains why individuals with schizophrenia often struggle with executive function, problem solving, and motor coordination. Next, gray matter. So, like I said, gray matter made of neural cell bodies, memory, movement, emotion, decision making. So, this is one of the most consistent findings. So in schizophrenia, we see widespread gray matter loss, especially in the frontal, temporal, and parietal lobes. So there is gray matter in all the structures of the brain. So the hippocampus, which is critical for memory, shrinks because the gray matter shrinks. And this is one reason why the hallucinations occur. And gray matter in the thalamus also shows severe reduction in volume, which helps process sensory information, and it leads to disorganized thinking and sensory misperceptions. What's more is that gray matter loss tends to worsen over time, especially in individuals with more severe symptoms. So, this progressive decline is linked to cognitive deficits, emotional instability, and impaired insight into the disorder. So, these changes may explain why the core symptoms of the schizophrenia and highlight why earlier intervention is so important. So lastly, ventricular enlargement. Again, ventricular is just the fluid-filled cavities in your brain. It's just space in your brain. So if you have enlarged ventricles, there's less brain tissue. So this is a hallmark feature of schizophrenia. It's again one of the most consistent findings. So this well-documented finding points to progressive brain shrinkage, and this potentially begins long before symptoms emerge. So, as for the discussion, just to summarize, so schizophrenia is marked by widespread gray and white matter loss, particularly in the frontal, temporal, parietal, as well as the hippocampal and thalamic atrophy. So, ventricular enlargements further suggest cerebral atrophy, and these structures deficits align with core symptoms such as impaired executive functioning, memory loss, sensory misperceptions, paranoia, hallucinations. And so, beyond structure, I explained that schizophrenia alters brain function. And so this impairs self-awareness and cognitive control, and hippocampal and temporal abnormalities contribute to hallucinations, and thalamocortical disruptions lead to attention deficits and disorder thinking. One key challenge when studying schizophrenia's brain effects is distinguishing disease-related changes by those induced by antipsychotic medications, which is a whole other place to explore. Many studies focus on first episode psychosis to separate these effects because the antipsychotics haven't had much time to actually deal damage to the brain. And but more longitudinal studies is needed to clarify the role of medication in structural and functional changes. And so some of the limitations were that this review was limited by cross-sectional studies and a 10-year publication window, which may exclude relevant findings. And future research should prioritize longitudinal studies to track brain changes over time and refine personalized treatment approaches targeting affected brain regions. So, just to conclude, schizophrenia isn't just a chemical imbalance, it's a full scale rewiring of the brain. Shrinking gray matter, you have faulty neural circuits, and disrupted communication between brain regions fuel its most defining symptoms. And antipsychotics offer relief, but their long term impact on brain structure remains a question mark. So, the next step is longitudinal studies, precision treatments, and a deeper dive into the brain's inner workings, because understanding the architecture of schizophrenia is the key to outsmarting it. And these are just my references. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adwaita. That was great. I mean, honestly, I enjoyed just listening to it. And so, the thing that I thought that I really enjoyed is one, when you set up the mission for your research, you said something very specific, is that the only way to get rid of a stigma for something is to research it, right? And I really appreciated that line because you actually had another line in there that actually would help me meet your mission of having this being less stigmatized. And that was when you were talking about the auditory hallucinations, you said it, your internal thoughts become actually real voices, right? That you're hearing. And I thought that that was really a unique way of looking at what auditory hallucinations are. I did have a question about when you talked about like the hippocampus and you were talking about hallucinations. You mentioned something there that like what happens is because the brain can't fill in the actual memory, the brain just substitutes that memory. Is that kind of what's happening there? Can you tell me a little bit more about
Yeah,
that?
so like I mentioned, so basically there's a lot of gray matter reduction or like just essentially your brain is kind of deteriorating. So places like the thalamus that control like your emotions, so they essentially become rewired, and that just contributes to a lot of paranoia. And so I mean you can imagine that like if your memory is faulty and you have so much paranoia, then obviously you're going to try to fill in the gaps. And it's just really scary to imagine that. Like you just don't like you don't know what's real. And it's yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you were going through the presentation, I'm just thinking about that. Like, it's scary that your mind's playing tricks on you,
Yeah.
you know? And imagine if that happened, what a scary state of affairs it would be. But I absolutely enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Edwita. Thank you.